You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the Corbett Report and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan. Welcome to the show, James.
Well, thanks for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to be here.
We're just talking about Goldman Sachs has finally settled for their role in the U.S. mortgage fraud, $5.1 billion. Now, is that fine adequate? Did anybody go to jail? And how much money did they make because of this fraud?
Well, that's really the operative question. $5.1 billion might sound like a lot in a contextless way when it's reported, as it is, as one of the largest, I believe the largest settlement in Goldman Sachs history. So it seems significant, but then you compare it to some of their banksters in crime, their partners in crime. Bank of America and J.P. Morgan Chase also, of course, involved in the mortgage-backed securities fraud that caused the subprime mortgage meltdown in 2007-2008. Bank of America had a $16.6 billion settlement, and J.P. Morgan Chase a $13 billion settlement. So Goldman Sachs is getting off relatively light here, and especially light when you do take a look at, of course, one of the first things that the Department of Justice, I suppose you could call it that, in the United States did when they started their investigations into this was to declare that there would be no one even prosecuted for these crimes, let alone go to jail for them. But then the other thing to keep in mind is that the Goldman Sachs, of course, we've seen some of the internal emails come out during these congressional investigations that have taken place over the past few years that prove that they not only created the subprime mess by bundling up these mortgage-backed securities into toxic derivative garbage and then pawning it off on their customers, but they were, and calling them Muppets and other four-letter words besides in their internal emails, of course, but they also were betting against those very investments even as they were selling them to their customers. And that was a very profitable decision because in 2007, pre-tax profits for Goldman Sachs was over $17 billion. And in 2009, in the height of the meltdown and the crisis where Main Street was starting to really feel the pinch, Goldman Sachs was doing just fine. Their pre-tax profits that year were just shy of $20 billion. So that at least puts this $5 billion settlement in some perspective.
In other words, no punishment at all and no discouragement from doing it again.
Slap on the wrist and encouragement indeed to do it again, as we're seeing with all sorts of bubbles, including the subprime auto bubble.
Right, where people are taking out 8-9 year loans on vehicles that, of course, 2 or 3 years into that loan won't be worth what they're paying.
It looks like the mirror image of what happened with the housing bubble last year, and of course, last decade. And of course, the housing bubble itself is also still inflated. So yes, unfortunately, we're in just as bad a situation, but perhaps even worse, because again, part of the precedent that was set during this past global financial collapse was this precedent of not prosecuting anyone, not even putting anyone before a judge or jury, let alone sending anyone to jail.
Right. So another financial disaster, say, a lot of people saying it's looming right now. You're seeing it in the stock markets, the price of oil. And meanwhile, these jokers are still riding around in their yachts, lighting very expensive Cuban cigars, legally now in the U.S., and celebrating the fact that they're ripping us off. I mean, there's even the movie, The Big Short, that explains what happened last time, and we're just seeing a bigger version of it this time, are we?
I think we are, and it is interesting to see some of the coverage coming out of Davos, trying desperately, I think, to avoid what's happening in the markets right now, which of course is carnage. Of course, one of the worst starts to the U.S. equities markets in history, or at least since the Great Depression. So the worst start in the modern era, and it's like that pretty much across the board. There is no positive financial news coming out anywhere right now, and yet, of course, they are living it up in Davos and trying to sound like they're still the masters of the universe, puppeteering all of this. I think quite a few of the people who are living at large in Davos right now are going to be, hopefully in the unemployment line by the end of the year. Probably not as many as should be, but still.
Well, I've heard that Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is going to be asking world leaders to give Canada a little help to get through the economic crisis. France has already declared an economic emergency. Is this a case that everybody's heading for the lifeboats? There's nobody there to pick you up once you're in the water?
I think that is a pretty good analogy, and I think that's just the logical consequence of the last 8 years of avoiding this collapse, which is exactly what the last 8 years represents. It was the QE heroin re-leveraging bid, where of course it should have been a time of deleveraging, but what we've seen is in fact global debt levels continuing to rise all throughout that time period, and the United States, Canada, no exception there. It's unfortunately the piper has to be paid at some point, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing playing out right now. I do not expect that we're ever going to get back to that record levels of that we were seeing in the stock markets being set in the last few years. I think this is part of a downward trend. I think the only question is how long and how deep does it go. But for commodity, primarily resource-based, commodity-based economies like Canada, unfortunately, still largely is, it's going to be a very rough ride, as unfortunately the commodity deflation route is not likely to turn around anytime soon.
Who's going to consume anything if China is slowing down?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question for the global economy, isn't it? And unfortunately, yes, China is undoubtedly slowing down, even by their phony cooked numbers that they like to put out to the public, which they admit secretly behind the scenes, as we now know from leaked documents, that they don't even trust those numbers themselves. But that being what it is, yes, who is going to pick up the slack? And unfortunately, there's no one at the table at this point. So it really is a question of, I think, how short and sharp this correction, if we can call it that, is going to be, not a question of whether we can pull out of it.
Well, I bet you if we take a look at what China predicted their growth would be over the past year, they probably predicted 6.9%, because I think I've done that before, and sure enough, 6.9% at the end of the year.
Yes, well, I think the official target is still 7%, and it has met that right on the button many, many quarters in a row. But maybe they're now admitting that it's kind of slowing down, and they're getting the public used to it. So what is the least possible increment you could miss your prediction by? Well, 0.1%. So I think that might be a little bit of what's going on. But yes, I think we should take that number with a huge grain of salt. But at the same time, it is signaling. It is obviously, I think, intended as a signal to the markets that, yes, China is slowing down, and they are aware of that. And it's absolutely not going to be picking up this year from if any of the signals that we're getting right now continue and the trends being what they are. This is not likely to be a trend that's going to be pulled out of, because again, as you point out, the question is not just the underlying productive capacity, but the demand, and global demand is absolutely shrinking right now.
Is China keeping factories open so that workers won't rebel if they're laid off?
I think that this is a part of the economic and political calculation that is increasingly important to the Chinese government, which I think for the first time in its history really has something resembling a type of burgeoning class. I'm not sure if I could say middle class, but some sort of burgeoning entrepreneurial type class in its ranks, which does represent a political force that could be unleashed against the government itself if the Chinese economic miracle of recent decades really starts to take a plunge. And that's exactly why they've been so desperate to try to prop up the stock markets, which they rounded everyone up into over the past couple of years by promising basically that they were going to keep those markets up. And I think if they fail to live up to that promise in some meaningful way, I think they really could start seeing a breakdown in political order, because people are happy enough to go along with regimes, even fairly authoritarian ones, as long as their bread is being buttered and everything seems to be growing. But when the brakes are put on that process, it's a very different story. So I think they're very concerned and very aware of the possibility of this turning into not just an economic problem for China, but a political one.
Sure. I mean, they're still very aware of their own political revolution that created the modern Chinese government. Hard times for millions of people, and they don't like it. That's
unfortunately, yes. I mean, and people have to understand that this is still an economy that, although it's tried to paint itself as being liberalized, it's still run by 5-year plans, and the next 5-year plan is already, about to be formalized, rubber stamped by the Chinese, quote unquote, Parliament, Congress, whatever they call themselves. So it's still very much a controlled economy, and I don't think they're able to, let alone want to give up that control anytime soon. And that's going to be a significant factor as the economy starts slowing down. Because as we've seen, for example, with their circuit breakers that they tried and failed to implement in the stock markets, once you've got enough controls on, or that much control over the economy, there's not much more you can do when things start going south.
And of course, with the 7% circuit breakers, that doesn't allow the market to bounce back like it just did today in North America, where they had massive losses. But at the end of the day, in some markets, it had almost come back.
That's right. In fact, of course, one of the unintended consequences of those circuit breaker mechanisms is that they cause people to start selling more rapidly as it approaches that 7%. And as you say, it doesn't allow for that correction back upwards. So it was a failure, and that's why they suspended the rule. And that's why there's going to have to be some other mechanism that they try to use. So, of course, the latest news that we're just getting now is that the People's Bank of China has just injected the most cash in almost 3 years in open market operations. So they've just conducted 110 billion yuan of 7-day reverse repo agreements and 290 billion yuan of 28-day contracts. So they're furiously trying to pump money into the markets right now to try to keep things afloat, and we'll see what effect that has. But nothing that they've tried so far has done much in terms of increasing productive economic activity, we'll put it that way. They may have averted the complete collapse that it looked like it was going into last summer, but it really just seems to be a question of if they can even hold the boat at the level that it's at right now, let alone try to get the tide to rise.
Is China spending this money because they have a large stock of foreign currency?
Well, they do have a fairly large amount of reserves, but they have been spending those reserves to try to keep the currency up and to try to keep the markets up. I don't think that's going to work out very well, and I think that they are, in fact, not anytime soon, but they would at some point be looking at running out of their ability to do that as the reserves start to dwindle. So I think that, again, this is something, they are able to do certain things right now, but it's more, I think, a question of trying to signal to markets what they can do rather than actually do it. Because once you fire that gun, if you find out that if the ammunition that you had in the gun isn't enough, there may not be time to reload.
And plus, you can't recall that bullet.
Exactly. Again, unintended consequences. And one of them that I think is going to be extremely interesting to look at over the course of this year is the question of further Chinese yuan devaluation and whether they can keep a lid on Chinese capital outflows, because that will have a huge effect on the future of real estate in New York, London, and Vancouver, of course.
Right now, is there much discussion about how much money has moved from China to real estate in North America?
Yes, in certain sectors. I've seen it covered certainly in certain alternative media online. I don't know if there's a lot of talking heads on the main networks that are talking about this, but it absolutely is undeniable that there is a direct influence there. And again, it's a question of if China can tighten those controls to a point where that money isn't able to escape so easily, then that could definitely have an effect on real estate valuations in those major markets.
Well, the first thing they did to lift the lid off the one-child policy was that if you invested in at least $200,000 in foreign real estate, you were allowed to have a second child. A lot of people took that bait, and $200,000 when it comes to real estate, at least in Vancouver, you couldn't get a doghouse for that.
Yes. No, you couldn't. But again, if the signals are that they want people to move money offshore, then that will have an effect. And of course, it's cumulative effect. But I think ultimately they want to try to keep that capital in the country. So I think there's going to be countercurrents that we're going to see. And again, I think it's going to really come down to how fast they devalue the yuan, because I don't think they're done devaluing. I think that it has further to devalue, at least if the U.S. dollar continues to be the juggernaut that it is right now.
How is Japan's economy doing?
Not well, to put it short. And if we take the market valuation, which I certainly don't think is a reflection of economic capacity per se, but at any rate, the Nikkei just entered bear market territory, under 20% down since its height. So I think we are definitely seeing that the Abenomics hope and change version of the economic system that Shinzo Abe was proposing when he was elected here a couple of years ago has signally failed. And all of the gains that were made, even in the stock market, which did not translate into productive economic gains, but there was market valuation gains anyway. Even those have been erased now. So I think the emperor has been exposed as wearing no clothes, and there's really very little in terms of bright spots on the Japanese horizon in terms of anything that's going to come along to reverse the direction on this. And of course, underlying all of this is the demographic time bomb that continues to tick here as the population continues to grow older, and you have fewer and fewer workers supporting more and more retirees.
Canada, of course, plans to accept 25,000 Syrian refugees, and that doesn't include, of course, normal immigration to Canada. Are countries that accept refugees doing the right thing? Because they're usually people with young families with 5 or 6 kids.
Well, that would certainly be one of the arguments made in favor of doing this, that if we are in demographic decline, then we have to open up the borders and allow more people in. I'm not sure that the refugees themselves are in the numbers that would make significant demographic difference, but I think that would be one of the arguments that would be used in favor of that policy.
I understand the Japanese yen on the currency markets is outperforming the U.S. dollar currently. Why would that happen if their economy is not doing well?
I think that the USD-JPY correlation is a complicated one, and it's not specifically or solely tied to economic considerations in terms of whether the economy of Japan or even the U.S. is doing well. I think it's related to a number of things. I think one of them is something that, in fact, Bernanke, I believe, was quoted as saying recently, and it's something I actually agree on him for a change, is that the run-up in the U.S. dollar index that we've seen in the last couple of years has probably mostly played itself out. And we're not expecting the U.S. dollar to continue leaving all the other currencies in the dust indefinitely. I think that's probably slowing down, and we see that reflected in the decreasing U.S. valuation against a number of currencies at the moment. So I think what's going on with regards to the U.S. dollar and Japanese yen is a reflection of the fact that the Japanese policy of devaluing the yen has started to peter out. They can't really, they've printed what they said they were going to print, and I think that downward effect on the yen is starting to curtail. And then also on top of that, you see the U.S. dollar starting to slow down in terms of the way it's been outpacing other currencies. And then there's the other considerations about the unwind of the QE era and some of those dollars flooding back into the country and what's going to happen with regards to the U.S. dollar valuation with regards to that. So I think all of those forces play into a situation that is, it's looked at with fear by the central bankers of Japan, because their entire policy has been to try to keep the yen as cheap as possible compared to the dollar, and that appears to be unwinding right now.
What's happening with Fukushima? What's the cost of the cleanup going to be there, or can they clean it up?
Well, they can clean it up in the sense that they can do their type of radioactive scrubbing and removing top layer of soil and hosing down various villages and things in the area as they've been doing. But in terms of actually addressing the underlying problem itself, the actual melted through cores at the reactors, well, they still haven't found a way to get any true handle on that situation. But the estimated cleanup costs, again, it's really only an estimate at this point, but they're talking in the terms of $500 billion over the course of however many decades it takes to finally get that situation under control and contained. So, again, that's really just a ballpark estimate, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what they're dealing with and why it was so important for the Japanese government to essentially nationalize TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company that operated the plant in the wake of the crisis, because TEPCO obviously doesn't have $500 billion to be able to divert and devote to that type of cleanup.
Well, having been victim of the only 2 atomic bomb blasts in the world used in anger, you'd think the Japanese would have been a little more careful with atomic material.
It is absolutely mind-boggling to think that the only victims of atomic bombings in warfare have been one of the nations to most completely embrace nuclear power. I guess it makes sense, of course, in the strict economic sense that this is an island nation without a lot in terms of petrochemical resources to play with. But I think another extremely important part of this was the Atoms for Peace program that Eisenhower used to spread nuclear energy around the world. was very much specifically targeted the Japanese population, and there was a very popular roving exhibit that was put on by sponsored by the U.S. government talking about nuclear power in the 1950s. It was heavily promoted in the Japanese media by people that were now found to be on the payroll of the CIA. It was a long-term program to win over the hearts and minds of the Japanese public, along with, of course, a lot of money to grease the skids and make sure that municipalities and other local governments would go along with placing these reactors in their backyard. And it was remarkably successful. And I think the ongoing, enduring legacy of that continues to be seen in the fact that the reactors are, of course, now being restarted and coming back online, even now, even with significant questions about whether a Fukushima-type event could be repeated in a number of locations around the country. But at the end of the day, the mighty yen, I guess, wins out over those types of concerns.
Yes, they didn't learn anything from all those Godzilla movies about what happens when you release radiation into the ocean.
There's clearly some fundamental psyche, fundamental part of the Japanese psyche that's been scarred by the nuclear bombings, but unfortunately that hasn't played out into looking at alternative ways of trying to power the country.
Cheap oil in North America, how has that affected life in Japan, or has it brought down gasoline prices there much?
Not as significantly as you would think it should if the price of gasoline was really directly related to the price of oil in that kind of way, but it has had a downward effect of a noticeable downward effect, but not a huge one. It is, I think, a relief to the Japanese economy that has been importing hydrocarbon petrochemicals quite quickly, quite furiously in the last few years to try to make up for some of the nuclear energy shortfall. So that is, I think, something of a break for the Japanese economy. But I think overall, I mean, obviously, for oil exporter nations like Canada, this is, I mean, cataclysm. And being born and raised in Alberta myself, I know that this is extremely difficult time for Alberta and for, well, really all of Canada, as not just the oil glut, but the commodity deflation glut continues to reign.
Any hope that Japan would be a good customer for BC LNG?
Well, they are a good customer for LNG overall, so I can't imagine that anything that it helps to increase the trade between Japan and BC in that regard would be a bad thing for either economy. I think they both Japan definitely needs LNG, so if BC has it, I'm sure they're a willing customer.
Come and get it. We have lots. Something like 200 years of proven reserves. That's a lot.
Well, yeah, exactly. And the infrastructure for getting that over here has to be ramped up. But other than that, I mean, clearly Japan is on the market for it.
James, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's been speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.